I was standing at my husband's funeral when a woman I'd never seen before walked up to the casket and collapsed in tears, calling him my darling Raymond, my precious husband. I remember thinking she must have been confused, must have wandered into the wrong service because Raymond was my husband. Mine. We'd been married for 42 years. But then another woman appeared, and another and another. By the time the service was supposed to start, there were 8 of us. 8 wives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 8 women who had loved the same man, built lives with the same man, believed in the same lies. And standing there in that funeral home, surrounded by flowers and hymns and the smell of lilies that would forever make me sick to my stomach, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life had been a carefully constructed fiction. My name is Dorothy Mae Harrison, and I'm 73 years old. I've lived in the same house in Cleveland, Ohio for the past 4 decades. I've worked as a nurse for 50 years, retired just last month with a small pension and a gold watch they gave me at the hospital. I raised 2 daughters, kept a clean home, cooked dinner every night, and loved my husband with a devotion that now feels like the cruelest joke God ever played on me. I thought I knew who I was. I thought I knew what my life meant. I thought I understood the shape and texture of my own existence. But I was wrong about everything. The morning of Raymond's funeral started like any terrible morning starts, with that moment right after you wake up when you forget for just a second that something awful has happened. I opened my eyes and reached across the bed the way I'd done for 42 years, expecting to feel the warmth of Raymond's body next to mine, expecting to hear his soft snoring or feel him shift and mumble something about needing coffee. But the bed was cold and empty, and then I remembered. Raymond was dead. My husband was gone. He'd had a massive heart attack 3 days earlier while he was supposedly on one of his business trips, and by the time anyone found him, it was too late. I lay there in that empty bed staring at the ceiling, watching the morning light filter through the curtains, feeling the weight of grief pressing down on my chest like a boulder. We were supposed to grow old together. We were supposed to sit on the porch in our rocking chairs and watch the neighborhood kids play, and complain about our aching joints and reminisce about the good old days. We were supposed to have more time. But life doesn't care about what we're supposed to have, does it? Life just happens, cruel and random and utterly indifferent to our plans. I forced myself to get up. I had things to do. A funeral to attend. People to greet. Daughters to comfort even though I could barely hold myself together. I showered and dressed slowly, my hands shaking as I buttoned my black dress. The same black dress I'd worn to my mother's funeral 5 years ago and my father's funeral 10 years before that. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. When did I get so old? When did these lines appear around my eyes and mouth? When did my hair turn completely gray? I used to be pretty. Raymond used to tell me I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. He'd say it while we were dancing in the kitchen or lying in bed on Sunday mornings or sitting on the couch watching television. You're beautiful, Dorothy. I'm the luckiest man alive. I pushed the thought away. I couldn't think about Raymond's words right now. I couldn't think about all the tender moments and sweet promises and declarations of love. If I did, I'd fall apart completely, and I needed to be strong. For my daughters. For myself. For the life I thought we'd built together. My daughters, Patricia and Caroline, arrived at the house around 8 in the morning. Patricia, my oldest, came with her husband James and their 2 teenage sons. Caroline came alone. She'd divorced her husband 2 years ago, and was still navigating life as a single mother with a 6-year-old daughter. They both looked exhausted, their eyes red and swollen from crying, their faces drawn with grief. Patricia hugged me tight when she walked in, and I felt her whole body shaking. I can't believe he's gone, Mama, she whispered into my shoulder. I can't believe Daddy's really gone. I know, baby, I said, stroking her hair the way I used to when she was little and had bad dreams. I know. Caroline made coffee while Patricia and I sat at the kitchen table in silence. What do you say at a time like this? What words could possibly capture the enormity of loss? We just sat there holding hands, letting the quiet speak for us. James kept the boys occupied in the living room, probably to give us space to grieve. I could hear them talking in low voices, could hear the television playing softly in the background, could hear the normal sounds of life continuing even though mine felt like it had stopped. The funeral was scheduled for 11 o'clock at Mercy Baptist Church, The same church where Raymond and I had gotten married all those years ago. The same church where we'd baptized both our daughters. The same church where we'd sat every Sunday morning for decades, listening to Pastor Williams preach about faith and love and the grace of God. It felt right to have Raymond's service there, in the place that had been such a central part of our life together. We arrived at the church around 10:30. People were already gathering, filling the pews, speaking in hushed tones. So many people. Raymond had been well known in the community, well liked. He'd worked in pharmaceutical sales for 40 years, traveling constantly, meeting people all over the Midwest. Everyone seemed to have a story about Raymond, about his kindness or his humor or his generosity. A steady stream of people came up to me offering their condolences, squeezing my hand, telling me how sorry they were, how much Raymond would be missed. "Thank you," I said over and over again like a broken record. "Thank you for coming. He would have appreciated it. Thank you so much." The funeral director, a thin, nervous man named Mr. Peterson, guided us to the front row. The casket was already there, positioned at the front of the church, closed and covered with a spray of white roses. I'd chosen white roses because they were Raymond's favorite. He used to bring them home for me on our anniversary every year without fail. 12 white roses, one for each month of loving you, he'd say with that crooked smile of his that made my heart skip a beat even after all these years. I sat down in the front pew with Patricia on one side and Caroline on the other. My grandsons sat next to their father. Caroline's little girl, Emma, sat quietly on her mother's lap, too young to fully understand what was happening but sensing the sadness in the air. The church continued to fill. I recognized most of the faces, neighbors and friends and people from Raymond's work and my work at the hospital. Mrs. Chun from across the street. The Johnsons from 2 doors down. Raymond's old friend Michael from his poker group. My former supervisor at the hospital, Linda Martinez, who'd come out of retirement to attend. Pastor Williams stepped up to the pulpit and asked everyone to take their seats. The low murmur of conversation died down. People settled into the pews. The organist began playing Amazing Grace softly in the background. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe, tried to prepare myself for what was coming. This was it. This was the moment when we'd say goodbye to Raymond forever. This was the moment when my old life ended and whatever came next began. And then I heard it. A voice. A woman's voice, loud and raw with emotion, cutting through the solemnity of the moment like a knife. "Raymond. Oh God, Raymond, my darling, how could you leave me?" My eyes snapped open. I turned around to see who was speaking, who would be so dramatic, so inappropriate at a funeral. And that's when I saw her. A woman I'd never seen before in my life, maybe in her early 60s, with red hair piled high on her head and too much makeup running down her face in black streaks. She was wearing a black dress that was far too tight, far too revealing for a funeral, and she was stumbling down the aisle toward the casket like she couldn't see straight. The entire church went silent. Every head turned to watch this woman as she made her way to the front. She was sobbing, actually sobbing, her whole body convulsing with grief. When she reached the casket, she threw herself across it, her arms spread wide, her face pressed against the polished wood. "My husband," she wailed. "My precious husband. What am I going to do without you?" I felt Patricia stiffen beside me. I heard Caroline whisper, "Who is that?" I opened my mouth to say something, to tell Mr. Peterson to remove this woman who was clearly confused or mentally unwell, but before I could speak, another voice rang out. "Excuse me, but Raymond was my husband." I turned again, my head spinning, and saw another woman standing in the middle aisle. This one was younger, maybe in her 50s, with dark skin and close-cropped natural hair. She was dressed more appropriately in a simple black suit, but her face was twisted with confusion and anger. "I don't know who you are," the second woman said, pointing at the redhead draped over the casket, "but you need to stop this. You're making a scene at my husband's funeral." "Your husband?" The redhead lifted her head. Her mascara-streaked face contorted with rage. "Your husband? Lady, I've been married to Raymond Harrison for 38 years. Who the hell are you?" The church erupted. People started whispering, murmuring, shifting in their seats. Pastor Williams looked like he'd been struck by lightning, his mouth hanging open, his Bible forgotten in his hands. Mr. Peterson rushed forward, trying to calm the situation, trying to restore order, but it was too late. The chaos had begun. I sat frozen in my pew, unable to move, unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of nightmare. But then a third woman stood up from a pew near the back. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking, "but I think there's been a terrible mistake. Raymond Harrison is my husband. We've been married for 35 years. We live in Detroit." A fourth woman rose from the opposite side of the church, tears streaming down her face. "This can't be happening," she said. "Raymond is my husband. We live in Indianapolis. We've been married for 30 years. And then they kept coming. A fifth woman from the middle section. A sixth from near the door. A seventh who'd been standing in the back. And finally an eighth. A tiny elderly woman with white hair who looked absolutely shattered. By the time they were all standing, by the time all 8 of us were looking at each other across that church, I felt like I was floating outside my body, watching this scene unfold from somewhere far away. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Raymond was my husband. Mine. We'd built a life together. We'd raised children together. We'd grown old together. How could there be 7 other women making the same claim? Patricia grabbed my hand so hard it hurt. "Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mama, what's going on?" "I don't know," I said. But the words sounded strange coming out of my mouth, like someone else was speaking. "I don't know." Mr. Peterson was frantically trying to get control of the situation, asking everyone to please calm down. Please take their seats. Please let's handle this with dignity. But dignity had left the building. The 8 of us, 8 women who'd all been married to the same man, were staring at each other with a mixture of horror, disbelief, and dawning understanding. The redhead was named Vivian. She lived in Chicago and claimed she'd been married to Raymond for 38 years, longer than anyone else. The woman with the natural hair was named Angela, from Milwaukee, married 36 years. There was Ruth from Detroit, married 35 years. Linda from Indianapolis, married 30 years. Susan from Columbus, married 28 years. Patricia from Cincinnati, not my daughter but another Patricia entirely, married 25 years. Margaret from Toledo, married 22 years. And finally, the tiny elderly woman with white hair, whose name was Helen from Akron, married 20 years. And me, Dorothy from Cleveland, married 42 years. I had been his wife the longest. I had been the first. The original. All the others had come after me, built on the foundation of the lie that Raymond and I had created together when we stood in this very church and promised to love and honor and cherish until death do us part. Only Raymond had apparently interpreted those vows very differently than I had. Pastor Williams eventually managed to get everyone to sit down. The 8 of us ended up in the front rows, no longer separated by the aisle but grouped together like some kind of bizarre support group. The funeral proceeded in a fog. I don't remember anything Pastor Williams said. I don't remember the hymns or the prayers or the eulogy. I just sat there, numb and disconnected, trying to understand how this was possible. Raymond traveled for work. That's what he'd always told me. He was on the road 3 or 4 days a week, sometimes more, selling pharmaceuticals to hospitals and clinics and doctors' offices all over the Midwest. He'd be gone from Monday through Thursday most weeks, sometimes coming home for the weekend, sometimes staying gone for 2 weeks at a stretch if there were conferences or training sessions or important meetings with clients. I'd gotten used to it over the years. I'd learned to manage the household on my own, to raise the girls mostly by myself during the week, to be self-sufficient and independent because that's what you did when your husband had a demanding career. But now I understood. Raymond hadn't been traveling for work. Or rather, he had been, but that wasn't the whole story. He'd been traveling between wives. Between families. Between lives. He created an entire system, an elaborate schedule that allowed him to maintain 8 separate households, 8 separate relationships, 8 separate identities. How was that even possible? How did he keep track of it all? How did he remember which version of himself he was supposed to be in which city on which day? The funeral ended. People filed out quietly, awkwardly, shooting glances at the 8 of us sitting in those front pews like exhibits in a museum. No one knew what to say. What could you say? This was unprecedented. This was beyond anything anyone had experienced or could imagine. Mr. Peterson approached us cautiously, wringing his hands, clearly wishing he were anywhere else in the world. "Ladies," he said, his voice thin and reedy, "we need to discuss the burial arrangements. There seems to be some, confusion about who has the legal authority to make decisions regarding Mr. Harrison's remains." "I'm his legal wife," I said, my voice sounding strange and hollow. "I have the marriage certificate. We were married first." "So do I," Vivian said sharply, pulling a folded piece of paper from her purse. "I have a marriage certificate too. And I was with him longer than most of you." "This is insane," Angela said, shaking her head. "This is absolutely insane. How could he do this? How could he marry all of us? Did any of you ever suspect?" Ruth asked quietly. "Did any of you have any idea?" We all looked at each other. Slowly, one by one, we shook our heads. No. None of us had known. None of us had suspected. Raymond had been that good at lying, that skilled at compartmentalizing, that capable of living 8 completely separate lives without any of them bleeding into each other. "We need to talk," Susan said. "All of us. We need to figure out what happened, how this happened, and what we're going to do about it." "I don't want to talk to any of you," Vivian snapped. "I want to bury my husband and go home and mourn in peace." "He's not just your husband," Linda shot back. "He's apparently all of our husbands, and I think we deserve answers." We agreed, finally, after much arguing and many tears, to meet at my house. It felt wrong inviting these women, these strangers who were somehow intimately connected to my life, into the home I'd shared with Raymond. But where else could we go? We couldn't have this conversation in a church. We couldn't hash out the details of Raymond's betrayal in a restaurant or a coffee shop or anywhere public. So my house it would be. The house on Maple Street where I'd lived for 40 years, where I'd raised my daughters, where I'd kissed Raymond goodbye every Monday morning and welcomed him home every Thursday evening, never knowing that he was leaving me to go to another wife, another home, another life. Patricia and Caroline didn't want to leave me alone with these women. They thought I might have a breakdown or that the situation might turn violent. But I needed to do this without them. I needed to face this truth, however ugly and painful it might be, without my daughters watching me fall apart. "It's okay," I told them, hugging them both tight before they left. "I need to do this. I need to understand." So they went home reluctantly, making me promise to call them if I needed anything. And then I waited for the other wives to arrive. 7 women who'd shared my husband without any of us knowing it. 7 women whose lives were just as shattered as mine. 7 women who were looking for the same answers I was. They arrived one by one over the next hour. Angela came first, still wearing her black suit, her face tight with anger. Then Ruth. Then Linda. Then Susan. Margaret showed up with a bottle of wine, which felt both inappropriate and absolutely necessary. Patricia, the other Patricia, arrived looking shell-shocked, like she couldn't quite believe any of this was real. Helen, the elderly woman from Akron, came last, moving slowly with a cane, her eyes red from crying. Vivian never showed up. I waited for her, checking my watch every few minutes, but she didn't come. Maybe she couldn't face it. Maybe she wanted to hold on to her version of Raymond, her version of their marriage, without having it contaminated by the rest of us. I understood that impulse. Part of me wished I could do the same. We gathered in my living room. 8 women sitting in awkward silence, not knowing where to begin. I made coffee more out of habit than anything else, needing something to do with my hands. The house felt too small suddenly, too cramped with all these bodies, all this grief, all this rage. Finally, Angela spoke. "We should introduce ourselves properly. Tell our stories. Figure out how Raymond managed to pull this off." So that's what we did. One by one we told our stories. And with each story the full picture of Raymond's deception became clearer and more horrifying. Angela went first. She lived in Milwaukee, about 90 miles from Cleveland. She'd met Raymond 36 years ago at a medical conference where she was working as a nurse and he was exhibiting for his pharmaceutical company. They'd fallen in love quickly, gotten married within 6 months. Raymond told her he traveled for work constantly, that the pharmaceutical business required him to maintain relationships with clients across multiple states. She'd believed him. Why wouldn't she? He came home every weekend, or most weekends anyway. He provided for her financially. He called her every night when he was on the road. He seemed devoted. But he always kept his work separate, Angela said, her voice trembling. He said it was company policy, that he couldn't share client information or travel schedules with anyone outside the company for confidentiality reasons. I never questioned it. I trusted him. Ruth's story was similar. She'd met Raymond in Detroit 35 years ago. Same story, medical conference, whirlwind romance, quick marriage. Same excuses about travel and work and company policies. Same pattern of being gone during the week and coming home on weekends, or whenever his schedule allowed. Linda from Indianapolis had been married to Raymond for 30 years. She'd met him at a pharmacy where she worked. He'd come in to promote a new medication, they'd started talking, and before she knew it, she was in love. He'd proposed within 3 months. Her wedding had been small, just immediate family, because Raymond said he didn't have much family and preferred to keep things intimate. Looking back now, she realized he'd wanted to keep things small to minimize the risk of someone from one of his other lives showing up. Susan had married Raymond 28 years ago in Columbus. She'd been a widow when they met, lonely and vulnerable after losing her first husband to cancer. Raymond had swept into her life like a knight in shining armor, offering comfort and companionship and eventually love. She'd felt so grateful to have a second chance at happiness. Now she felt like a fool. Margaret from Toledo had the same story. 22 years ago, met at a hospital, fell in love, got married, never suspected a thing. Patricia from Cincinnati, 25 years, another nurse, another whirlwind romance, another web of lies. Helen from Akron, the youngest marriage at 20 years, had met Raymond when she was already in her 50s, a late-in-life romance that had felt like a blessing. And then it was my turn. I told them about meeting Raymond 42 years ago when I was just 31 years old, fresh out of nursing school, working my first real job at Cleveland General Hospital. He'd walked into the nurses' station one day with a smile that lit up the room and a briefcase full of pharmaceutical samples. We'd talked for hours that first day. He'd asked me out to dinner. I'd said yes. Within a year we were married. I told them about our wedding at Mercy Baptist Church, about the small apartment we'd lived in while we saved for a house, about getting pregnant with Patricia and then Caroline, about buying the house on Maple Street and making it our home. I told them about all the years of Raymond traveling, coming and going, and how I'd learned to build a life that functioned around his absence. I told them about believing we were happy, believing we had a good marriage, believing that the sacrifices were worth it because we loved each other. My voice broke when I got to that part. The love part. Because how could it have been love? How could Raymond have loved me, loved any of us, and done what he did? When I finished, we all sat in silence. The coffee had gone cold. The afternoon light was fading. And we were 8 women sitting in my living room, trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. He compartmentalized us, Angela said finally. Each of us lived in a different city, far enough apart that we'd never accidentally run into each other but close enough that he could drive between us easily. He built a schedule, probably had it mapped out down to the day. Monday through Thursday in one city, Friday through Sunday in another. Rotate through all 8 of us over the course of a month or so. Make sure each of us felt like we were getting enough attention to keep us from getting suspicious. But the money, Linda said. How did he afford 8 households? 8 mortgages or rent payments? 8 sets of bills? He made good money in pharmaceutical sales, I said slowly. Really good money. And he traveled so much that most of his expenses were covered by the company. Hotels, meals, transportation. He didn't have to pay for much except the houses and basic utilities. And he probably kept our living situations modest to make it more manageable. I thought about that. Raymond had always been careful with money. Not cheap exactly, but frugal. Our house was nice but not extravagant. We drove older cars. We didn't take expensive vacations. He'd always said we needed to save for retirement, for the girls' education, for emergencies. Now I realized he'd needed to stretch his income across 8 lives, 8 families, 8 futures. What about holidays? Margaret asked. How did he manage holidays? Christmas, Thanksgiving, birthdays? He rotated those too, I said, the pieces clicking into place in my mind. Some years he'd be with me for Christmas. Other years he'd say he had to work. Same with Thanksgiving. He'd always make sure to be there for some holidays but not all of them. And we all probably accepted it because he was always traveling, always working, always had legitimate sounding reasons for being somewhere else. The anger started building then. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger, but the cold, seething kind that settles into your bones and changes you at a molecular level. Raymond had stolen decades from all of us. He'd stolen our trust, our love, our faith in ourselves and in human goodness. He'd made fools of us. He'd taken 8 good women and turned our lives into punchlines. Did he have children with all of you? Ruth asked quietly. I shook my head. Just me. Patricia and Caroline. Thank God, Susan murmured. Can you imagine if there were multiple sets of children involved? But that was another piece of the puzzle, wasn't it? Raymond had been careful. He'd had children with me because we were his first marriage, his original life, the one he'd started when he was young and hadn't yet figured out his system. But after that, he'd made sure not to have more children. Too complicated. Too risky. Too many variables to control. We talked for hours. We compared notes, shared stories, looked for patterns. Some of us had joint bank accounts with Raymond. Some didn't. Some of us were listed on his life insurance policies. Some weren't. Some of us owned our homes jointly with him. Some rented. The financial picture was a mess. A tangled web that would probably take lawyers years to sort out. As the evening wore on, as we moved from coffee to wine to just sitting in exhausted silence, I realized something. These women weren't my enemies. They weren't the villains in this story. They were victims just like me. We'd all been betrayed by the same man. We'd all been deceived by the same elaborate lies. And somehow, impossibly, we were now bound together by this shared trauma. Before they left that night, we exchanged phone numbers. We promised to stay in touch, to share information as we learned more about Raymond's affairs, to support each other through whatever came next. It felt surreal, forming friendships with my husband's other wives. But what else could we do? We were in this together now, whether we liked it or not. After they were gone, after I'd closed the door and locked it and watched their cars disappear down Maple Street, I walked through my house looking at everything with new eyes. The furniture Raymond and I had picked out together. The pictures on the walls of our family, our life, our history. The bedroom where we'd slept together for 42 years. Everything felt contaminated now, tainted by the knowledge of what Raymond had been doing all this time. I found myself in his office, the small room at the back of the house where he'd kept his desk and filing cabinets and work papers. I'd rarely gone in there. Raymond had always said it was his space, his sanctuary, the place where he did his paperwork and made his calls and managed his business. I'd respected that. I'd given him his privacy. What a fool I'd been. I started opening drawers, rifling through files, looking for evidence, for proof, for anything that might help me understand. And that's when I found them. The calendars. Years and years of calendars, meticulously detailed, color-coded, perfect in their organization. Each wife had a different color. I was blue. Angela was red. Ruth was green. Linda was yellow. On, 8 different colors tracking 8 different lives. I sat down at his desk and traced my finger over the entries. Monday through Wednesday, blue Cleveland Dorothy. Thursday through Saturday, red Milwaukee Angela. Sunday through Tuesday, green Detroit Ruth. He'd rotated through us like clockwork, like we were appointments to keep, obligations to fulfill, items on a to-do list. The tears came then. Not quiet tears, but great heaving sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for the girl I'd been when I met Raymond, so young and hopeful and full of dreams. I cried for the woman I'd become, the one who'd dedicated her life to a man who'd seen her as nothing more than 1/8 of his grand scheme. I cried for my daughters, who'd grown up with a part-time father they'd adored, never knowing he was giving that same attention to 7 other families. I cried for all the years I'd wasted, all the moments I'd treasured, all the memories that were now revealed to be built on lies. And somewhere in the midst of that grief, something else started to grow. A resolve. A determination. Raymond had taken so much from me, from all of us. He'd stolen our time, our trust, our sense of reality. But he couldn't take our futures. He couldn't define who we became after his death. That was up to us. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. I didn't know how I was going to pick up the pieces of my shattered life and build something new. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to let Raymond's betrayal destroy me. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life as the woman who'd been deceived by her bigamist husband. I was going to be more than that. I was going to find a way to turn this pain into something meaningful. I just had to figure out how. I grew up in a small town called Millbrook, about 40 miles south of Cleveland, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody and secrets were currency. My mama worked at the local diner, slinging eggs and coffee from 5 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, 6 days a week. My daddy drove trucks long haul, which meant he was gone more often than he was home. I had 2 older brothers who left for the army the second they graduated high school, desperate to escape the suffocating smallness of our town. That left me at home with my mama, learning early what it meant to be alone even when you weren't technically by yourself. I wasn't pretty as a child. I was gangly and awkward with knobby knees and teeth that seemed too big for my face. The other kids at school made sure I knew it. They called me names, excluded me from their games, made jokes at my expense that cut deeper than they probably realized. Or maybe they did realize, and that was the point. Children can be cruel in ways adults have forgotten how to be, direct and merciless and utterly without empathy. I learned to make myself invisible, to fade into the background, to take up as little space as possible so maybe they'd forget I existed and leave me alone. But then something happened when I turned 16. My body changed. My face changed. The awkward angles softened into curves. The 2 big teeth suddenly fit perfectly in my smile. Boys who'd ignored me or mocked me started paying attention, started asking me to dances, started showing up at the diner where I'd started working part-time to help my mama with bills. I didn't trust it at first. I thought it was another joke, another way to humiliate me. But it wasn't. I'd become, by some accident of genetics and timing, attractive. Pretty even. Maybe beautiful if the light was right and you squinted a little. My mama warned me about boys and what they wanted. She told me stories about girls she'd known who'd gotten themselves in trouble, who'd believed the sweet words and promises and ended up pregnant and abandoned, their futures reduced to a cautionary tale. "Don't you make the same mistakes, Dorothy," she'd say, pointing her spatula at me like it was a weapon. "Don't you let some smooth-talking boy ruin your life before it even starts. You're smart. You can be something. Don't throw it away." So I focused on school. I kept my head down and my grades up. I didn't date much, didn't go to parties, didn't do any of the things other girls my age were doing. I had a plan. I was going to nursing school. I was going to get out of Millbrook and make something of myself. I was going to prove that I was more than just another diner waitress destined to spend her life pouring coffee and pretending to laugh at crude jokes from truckers passing through. I graduated high school near the top of my class. I got accepted to a nursing program at a community college in Cleveland with a small scholarship that covered most of the tuition. My mama cried when I got the acceptance letter, actual tears streaming down her weathered face. "You're going to do it, baby," she said, hugging me tight. "You're going to get out. You're going to be somebody." Nursing school was harder than I'd expected. The coursework was demanding, the hours were brutal, and I was competing with girls who'd had better educations, better preparation, better everything. But I worked harder than anyone else. I studied until my eyes burned and my head ached. I took extra shifts at the hospital where we did our clinical rotations, volunteering for the tasks no one else wanted, learning everything I could from the experienced nurses who took pity on this determined girl from nowhere. And it paid off. I graduated with honors. I passed my licensing exam on the first try. And I got a job at Cleveland General Hospital, a real job with benefits and a steady paycheck and the promise of a career. I was 22 years old and I felt like I'd conquered the world. I'd escaped Millbrook. I'd become somebody. I'd proven everyone wrong who'd ever doubted me or underestimated me or assumed I'd end up just like my mama, trapped and tired and full of regrets. That's when I met Raymond. He walked into the hospital on a Tuesday morning in March carrying a briefcase and wearing a suit that looked expensive even to my inexperienced eyes. He had this confidence about him, this ease in his own skin that I'd never seen before in anyone from my world. Most men I knew were either cocky in that insecure way that meant they were overcompensating, or beaten down by life into a kind of resignation. But Raymond was different. He seemed genuinely comfortable with who he was, genuinely at peace. He introduced himself to the head nurse first, professional and polite, explaining that he was there to discuss a new medication his company was promoting. But then he saw me standing there sorting through patient charts, and his whole face lit up with this smile that made my stomach flip. "And you are?" he asked, extending his hand toward me. "Dorothy Harrison," I said, shaking his hand and trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm one of the floor nurses." "Well, Dorothy Harrison," he said, still holding my hand a moment longer than necessary, "it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Raymond. Raymond Harrison." He paused, then grinned. "Wait, we have the same last name. That must be fate." I laughed. It was such a cheesy line, the kind of thing that should have made me roll my eyes. But something about the way he delivered it, with a self-awareness that acknowledged how ridiculous it was, made it charming instead of annoying. We talked for a few minutes while the head nurse was busy with something else. He asked about my job, how long I'd been nursing, whether I liked it. I found myself telling him things I normally wouldn't tell strangers, about growing up in Millbrook, about my mama, about how proud I was to have made it here. He listened. Really listened. Not the way men usually listen to women, with half their attention while scanning the room for someone more interesting. He focused on me completely, his eyes never leaving my face, asking follow-up questions, seeming genuinely interested in my answers. By the time the head nurse called him into her office to discuss the medications, I felt like I'd known him for years instead of minutes. He came back to the hospital the next week, and the week after that. He always made a point to stop by the nurse's station to say hello, to ask how I was doing, to tell me jokes or stories about his travels. After the third visit, he asked me to dinner. "Just dinner," he said, holding up his hands like he was surrendering. "Nothing fancy, nothing forward. Just two people with the same last name getting to know each other better." I said yes. Of course I said yes. How could I not? He was handsome and successful and interested in me. Plain Dorothy from Millbrook who'd spent most of her childhood being invisible. It felt like a miracle. Like the universe was finally paying me back for all those years of being overlooked and underestimated. Our first date was at a small Italian restaurant downtown. Raymond was a perfect gentleman. He pulled out my chair, asked what I liked before ordering wine, listened attentively as I talked about my work and my dreams. He told me about his job, about how he'd started in pharmaceutical sales right out of college and worked his way up through dedication and hard work. He talked about his family, or what little family he had. His parents had died when he was young, he said. He'd been raised by an aunt who'd since passed away. He had no siblings, no cousins he was close to. He was essentially alone in the world, building his life from scratch with nothing but his own determination and skill. I remember feeling such sympathy for him. Such a desire to be the family he'd lost. I told him about my mama and my brothers, about the town I'd come from and the life I was trying to build. He listened to all of it, nodding, asking questions, making me feel seen and valued in a way I'd never experienced before. We dated for 8 months before he proposed. 8 months of dinners and movies and walks through the park and long conversations that stretched late into the night. He was gone a lot for work, traveling to different cities to meet with clients and attend conferences. But when he was in Cleveland, he was completely present, completely devoted to me. He'd show up at the hospital with flowers. He'd take me to nice restaurants I could never have afforded on my own. He'd tell me I was beautiful, that he was lucky to have found me, that he couldn't imagine his life without me. The proposal happened on a Saturday evening in November. He'd planned a whole evening, starting with dinner at the nicest restaurant in Cleveland, the kind of place where the waiters wore tuxedos and the menus didn't have prices. I'd worn my best dress, a simple navy blue thing I'd bought specifically for occasions when Raymond took me somewhere fancy. Over dessert, he reached across the table and took my hand. "Dorothy," he said, his voice serious and his eyes locked on mine, "these past 8 months have been the happiest of my life. You're everything I've ever wanted. Everything I didn't even know I was looking for. You're smart and kind and beautiful, and you make me want to be a better man. I know we haven't known each other that long, but I know enough. I know that I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Then he got down on one knee right there in the restaurant, pulled out a small velvet box, and opened it to reveal a diamond ring that caught the candlelight and sparkled like captured stars. "Dorothy Harrison, will you marry me?" Everyone in the restaurant was watching. The waiters had stopped what they were doing. Other diners were craning their necks to see. Time seemed to slow down, to stretch into this perfect crystalline moment where everything in my life was about to change. I thought about my mama working at the diner, about the town I'd escaped, about all the years of being invisible and unimportant. And here was this wonderful man, this successful, handsome, kind man, asking me to be his wife, offering me a future I'd barely dared to dream about. "Yes," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Yes, of course, yes. The restaurant erupted in applause. Raymond slipped the ring on my finger and kissed me, and I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. We got married 3 months later at Mercy Baptist Church, the church my mama had started attending after she moved to Cleveland to be closer to me. It was a small wedding, just close friends and family. My mama was there beaming with pride. My brothers came home on leave from their respective military bases. Raymond's side was smaller, just a few colleagues from work and a distant cousin he barely knew. But it didn't matter. We were starting our life together, building something new, creating our own family to replace the ones we'd lost or left behind. The early years of our marriage were good. Better than good. We rented a small apartment while we saved money for a house. I continued working at the hospital, pulling long shifts and gradually building my reputation as a skilled and dedicated nurse. Raymond traveled constantly for work, sometimes gone 3 or 4 days a week, but when he was home, he was completely present. He'd help with cooking and cleaning. He'd rub my tired feet after long shifts. He'd tell me about his travels, about the cities he'd visited and the people he'd met. Looking back now, I can see how carefully he controlled the information he shared. He never gave me specific details about where he stayed or who he met with. He never invited me to come along on his trips, always saying it would be boring, that I'd be stuck in a hotel room while he was in meetings all day. He never introduced me to his colleagues, claiming they were just acquaintances, not real friends. But at the time I didn't question any of it. Why would I? I trusted him completely. He was my husband, the man I'd chosen to spend my life with, the man who'd chosen me. I got pregnant with Patricia 2 years after we were married. Raymond was thrilled. He talked about becoming a father with such excitement and tenderness that it made my heart swell. He came to every doctor's appointment that his schedule allowed. He helped me pick out baby furniture and paint the nursery in our new house, the house on Maple Street that we'd finally saved enough to buy. When Patricia was born, he cried actual tears as he held her for the first time. My girls, he kept saying, looking back and forth between me and our daughter. My beautiful girls. Caroline came 3 years later. Another planned pregnancy. Another source of joy and pride for Raymond. He doted on both our daughters. He'd play with them for hours when he was home, getting down on the floor to build block towers or have tea parties or whatever games they wanted to play. He read them bedtime stories in different voices that made them giggle. He never missed a birthday or a school play or a recital when he was in town. By all appearances, he was a devoted father and husband. But he was gone so much. That was the constant undercurrent of our family life, the thing that shaped everything else. Raymond traveled for work. That was just the reality of our situation. Monday through Thursday, sometimes longer, he'd be on the road. I learned to manage the household on my own, to be both mother and father to the girls during the week, to handle everything from scraped knees to parent-teacher conferences to bedtime routines without his help. Not that I minded exactly, or at least I told myself I didn't mind. This was what I'd signed up for. This was the price of the life we'd built. The girls learned early not to expect their father to be home for everything. When they'd ask where Daddy was, I'd tell them he was working, that he was traveling to help sick people get the medicine they needed, that he was doing important work. I turned his absence into a virtue, something noble and selfless, because what else could I do? I couldn't make them resent him. I couldn't poison them against their father just because I sometimes felt lonely or overwhelmed or like I was doing this whole parenting thing alone. And when Raymond was home, he made it count. That was the thing that kept me from complaining, from pushing back against his travel schedule. When he was there, he was fully there. He'd take us on weekend outings to the zoo or the museum or the park. He'd cook elaborate breakfasts on Sunday mornings. He'd sit with me on the couch after the girls went to bed and we'd talk about everything and nothing, just enjoying each other's company, reconnecting after days apart. Our intimate life remained strong too. Raymond was attentive and passionate, always making me feel desired and cherished. Even after 2 children and the inevitable changes to my body, he'd tell me I was beautiful, that he wanted me, that I was the most attractive woman he'd ever known. Those moments of physical connection helped bridge the gaps created by his absence. They reassured me that despite the distance and the time apart, we were still solid, still committed, still in love. The years passed in that pattern. Raymond traveling and coming home, traveling and coming home. The girls growing from babies to toddlers to school-age children to teenagers. Me advancing in my career at the hospital, eventually becoming a charge nurse, then a supervisor. We settled into a comfortable routine, a predictable rhythm that felt like stability even though it was built on absence as much as presence. I made friends with other women in similar situations, other wives whose husbands traveled for work. We'd get together for coffee or dinner while our husbands were away, commiserating about the challenges of single parenting during the week, joking about having to be our own handymen and decision makers and everything else. It helped to know I wasn't alone in this particular struggle, that other women understood what it was like to build a marriage around someone's absence. But I never stopped missing Raymond when he was gone. Even after decades of this pattern, I still felt a little flutter of excitement every Thursday evening when his car would pull into the driveway. I still rushed to greet him at the door like a newlywed. I still felt grateful that he'd chosen me, that despite all his travels and opportunities to meet other women, he'd remained faithful and committed to our family. What a joke that seems now. What a cosmic, cruel, devastating joke. Raymond was good with money, which I appreciated. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we were comfortable. He made a good salary in pharmaceutical sales and he was careful about how we spent it. We lived modestly, saved consistently, planned for the future. He handled most of the finances, claiming it was easier since he traveled so much and could keep track of things on the road. I didn't argue. Math had never been my strong suit, and I was happy to let him manage that aspect of our lives. He'd give me a household budget each month, money for groceries and utilities and the girls' activities. It was always enough, sometimes more than enough. If I needed anything beyond the regular budget, I just had to ask and he'd provide it. New tires for my car, a new washing machine when the old one died, money for Patricia's college application fees. He never made me feel bad about asking. He never acted like providing for his family was a burden. It all seemed so normal, so typical of how marriages worked in our generation. Now I understand he was controlling the information flow, making sure I never had access to the full picture of his finances. He kept separate accounts I didn't know about. He probably had different credit cards in different cities. He managed 8 households by keeping each of us on a tight budget, giving us just enough to live comfortably but not enough to start asking questions about where the rest of the money was going. My mama died when I was 53 years old. She'd been sick for a while, her heart giving out after decades of hard work and stress and cigarettes she'd smoked to get through each day. Raymond was wonderful through the whole ordeal. He took time off work to be with me during her final days. He held my hand at the funeral. He helped me clean out her small apartment afterward, sorting through the accumulated possessions of a life lived in service to others. He never complained about the time it took or the emotional energy it required. He was just there, solid and supportive and exactly what I needed. After Mama died, I felt unmoored for a while. She'd been my anchor, my connection to where I'd come from and who I'd been before I became Raymond's wife and the girl's mother. Without her, I had to figure out who Dorothy was, stripped of all those roles and relationships. Raymond helped me through that existential crisis. He'd listen to me talk about my fears and doubts and questions. He'd reassure me that I was valuable, that I mattered, that my life had meaning beyond the roles I played for other people. The girls grew up and moved out. Patricia first, heading to college and then staying away for a job opportunity in Boston. Caroline followed a few years later, studying education and eventually settling in Columbus to teach elementary school. The house felt enormous with just Raymond and me rattling around in it. I'd spent so many years focused on raising children, on managing a household, on being needed every minute of every day. Suddenly I had time to myself, space to think, quiet to fill. Raymond suggested I might want to work fewer hours, maybe cut back to part-time at the hospital. We could afford it now that the girls were self-sufficient. I could pursue hobbies, volunteer, travel with him occasionally when his schedule allowed. But I didn't want to cut back. My work was part of my identity, something I built independent of my role as wife and mother. So I kept working full-time, kept advancing in my career, kept finding meaning and purpose in caring for patients and mentoring younger nurses. Our marriage entered a new phase after the girls left. It was just the two of us again, like in those early years before children, but older now, more settled, more comfortable with each other. We'd have quiet dinners together when Raymond was home. We'd watch movies on the couch, his arm around my shoulders, my head on his chest. We'd make love in the middle of the afternoon on weekends, something we'd never had time for when the girls were home. We'd talk about retirement, about what we'd do when Raymond finally stopped traveling, about maybe buying a little place somewhere warm where we could spend our winters. It felt peaceful. It felt earned. We'd weathered the challenges of raising children and building careers and managing a marriage across distances. We'd made it work when so many others failed. We were going to grow old together, enjoy our golden years together, be buried side by side when the time came. Except we weren't. Because Raymond had 7 other lives, 7 other households, 7 other versions of this exact same relationship happening simultaneously in cities all across the Midwest. While I was sitting in our house on Maple Street thinking about our future together, he was sitting in 6 other houses thinking about 6 other futures with 6 other women. While I was feeling grateful for our strong marriage, he was maintaining 7 other marriages with the same dedication and care he showed me. How did I not see it? How did I not question the travel schedule that never varied, the work demands that never decreased, the phone calls he'd take in private, the way he always paid for everything in cash when we were together? How did I not notice that he never gave me specific details about his colleagues or his hotels or his clients? How did I accept such a compartmentalized version of his life without ever pushing for more access, more transparency, more truth? I think part of it was that I didn't want to know. I had a good life, a comfortable life, a life I'd worked hard to build. I had a husband who treated me well, who provided for our family, who showed up when it counted. Questioning that would have meant risking everything. So I chose not to question. I chose to trust. I chose to believe the story Raymond was telling because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. But I should have looked closer. I should have insisted on meeting his colleagues, on seeing his office, on having more details about his work life. I should have questioned why he never wanted me to travel with him, why he kept our finances so separate, why he was so protective of his privacy. I should have trusted my instincts the few times I felt like something was off, like he was hiding something, like there was a piece of the puzzle I couldn't quite see. Instead, I buried those doubts. I told myself I was being paranoid or insecure or silly. I told myself that good marriages were built on trust, and questioning your husband's every move was the sign of a weak relationship. I told myself that if I just kept being a good wife, kept making him happy, kept holding down the fort at home while he worked hard on the road, everything would be fine. What a fool I was. What a blind, trusting, naive fool. After finding those calendars in Raymond's office, after seeing my life reduced to a color-coded entry in his meticulous scheduling system, I couldn't sleep. I spent that first night sitting in his chair, going through every file, every drawer, every scrap of paper he'd left behind. I found more evidence of his deception with each discovery. Bank statements from accounts I didn't know existed. Credit card bills with charges from cities I'd never heard him mention. Receipts from jewelry stores where he'd apparently bought 8 versions of the same anniversary gift, one for each wife. A detailed spreadsheet tracking which stories he'd told to which woman, making sure he didn't accidentally repeat himself or contradict his previous lies. The level of organization was staggering. Raymond had essentially run 8 parallel lives with the efficiency of a military operation. He'd kept notes on each of our preferences, our schedules, our friends and families. He documented which lies he'd told about work trips and family emergencies and last-minute changes to his schedule. He'd created elaborate systems to ensure none of his wives would ever accidentally connect with each other, carefully spacing our cities far enough apart that we'd never randomly run into one another but close enough that he could drive between us without raising suspicion about excessive travel. And the money. Oh, the money. Raymond had been far more successful in pharmaceutical sales than I'd ever realized. He'd made well into 6 figures annually, possibly more. But instead of building wealth or investing for retirement or providing a luxurious lifestyle for any of us, he'd stretched that income across 8 households, keeping each of us comfortable but not extravagant, making sure none of us had access to enough information to piece together the full picture of his financial situation. I found insurance policies listing different beneficiaries. I found property deeds to 7 other houses in 7 other cities. I found marriage certificates, each one legal, each one binding, each one apparently valid even though bigamy was illegal in every state in this country. How had he managed that? How had he gotten marriage licenses without anyone checking to see if he was already married? Had he used different names? Different social security numbers? Had he bribed officials or exploited loopholes in bureaucratic systems? The more I discovered, the less I understood. Raymond had been living a lie so complex, so intricate, so carefully maintained that it seemed impossible for one human being to manage. Yet he'd done it for decades. 42 years with me. Slightly less with the others, but still decades with most of them. 42 years of getting up every day and deciding to continue this massive deception. 42 years of looking me in the eye and telling me he loved me while knowing he was going to another city tomorrow to tell another woman the exact same thing. What kind of person does that? What kind of moral vacuum allows someone to create that much pain, to betray that many people, to live that fundamentally dishonest an existence? And how did he do it without the guilt destroying him? How did he maintain that charming smile, that easy confidence, that appearance of being a good man when he was perpetrating one of the most elaborate acts of betrayal I'd ever heard of? I thought about all those years of marriage, all those moments I'd treasured, all those memories I'd held dear. Every one of them was tainted now, poisoned by the knowledge that Raymond had been living 7 other versions of the same moments with 7 other women. When he told me he loved me, he was telling them too. When he made love to me, he was making love to them too. When he promised to grow old with me, he was making the same promise to them. Nothing had been special. Nothing had been unique. Nothing had been real. The other wives started calling me the day after we'd all met at my house. Angela was first, her voice tight with controlled fury as she told me she'd found similar evidence in the apartment she'd shared with Raymond in Milwaukee. Calendars, spreadsheets, duplicate receipts. She'd been awake all night going through everything. And now she wanted to know what we were going to do about it. What can we do? I asked, exhaustion making my voice flat. He's dead. We can't confront him. We can't demand answers or explanations. We're just left holding the pieces of a puzzle we'll never fully solve. We can tell our stories, Angela said. We can make sure people know what he did. We can stop protecting his reputation just because he's not here to defend himself. Ruth called next, then Linda, then Susan. Each of them had found evidence in their own homes, their own lives. Each of them was reeling from discoveries that confirmed what we already knew but made it somehow more real, more concrete, more undeniable. Margaret sobbed on the phone, saying she'd found love letters Raymond had written to her that were word for word identical to letters he'd apparently written to at least 3 other wives. Patricia from Cincinnati had discovered photographs of Raymond with different women at what appeared to be the same vacation spots, wearing the same clothes, striking the same poses. He'd recycled everything, even his romantic gestures. Helen, the oldest of us at 78, called last. Her voice was quiet, almost defeated. I spent 20 years believing I'd found my soulmate, she said. 20 years thinking I was special, that our connection was unique. Now I find out I was just another name on a list, another household to maintain, another woman to deceive. We decided to meet again, this time at a neutral location. None of us wanted to sit in our homes surrounded by the lies Raymond had built into every corner of our lives. We chose a conference room at a local library. A sterile space with fluorescent lighting and cheap folding chairs that felt appropriately impersonal for the task ahead. 7 of us showed up. Vivian still refused to participate, apparently choosing to maintain her version of reality, rather than face the truth with the rest of us. Part of me envied her ability to live in denial. The rest of me pitied her for being so desperate to avoid pain that she'd reject the only people who could truly understand what she was going through. We spent hours that afternoon sharing what we'd discovered, comparing notes, filling in gaps in the timeline of Raymond's deception. Angela had found evidence that Raymond had started his second marriage to her just 6 years after marrying me. 6 years. Our daughter Patricia hadn't even been born yet when he'd stood in another church and made the same vows to another woman. By the time Caroline was born, he already had 3 wives. The pattern became clear as we pieced it together. Raymond would establish a relationship in a new city during his regular business travel. He'd court the woman carefully, learn her schedule, understand her life situation. He seemed to prefer nurses and other healthcare workers, probably because we understood demanding schedules and irregular hours. We were used to people being unavailable, used to making relationships work around shift work and on-call rotations. We were, in other words, the perfect victims for a man who needed women who wouldn't question his constant absence. Once he'd secured a new wife, he'd adjust his rotation to accommodate her. The color-coded calendar showed how he'd grown his operation over the years, adding wives one by one, refining his system with each addition. By the time he married Helen 20 years ago, He'd perfected the logistics. He knew exactly how long he could stay with each wife without raising suspicion, knew exactly what excuses would work, knew exactly how to make each woman feel loved and valued despite his frequent departures. Linda discovered that Raymond had faked a sister's death to explain a 2-week absence one year. Susan found evidence that he'd invented a sick mother who required his attention. Margaret learned he created an entire fictional brother who supposedly lived overseas and needed Raymond's help with various crises. Each lie had been carefully crafted, each excuse strategically deployed to justify the time he needed to spend with his other families. The financial picture was the most complex piece of the puzzle. Raymond had maintained separate bank accounts in each city, funneling money through a complicated network of transfers and cash withdrawals that made it nearly impossible to track. He'd apparently used different social security numbers for different marriages, which was identity fraud on top of bigamy. He'd purchased properties under various names, sometimes his own, sometimes using slight variations. Raymond Harrison, Ray Harrison, R.M. Harrison. Close enough to be legally defensible if questioned, different enough to avoid automatic detection by systems that might flag duplicate records. As we talked, as we shared and compared and analyzed, something unexpected happened. We started to bond, not in spite of our shared victimhood but because of it. These women understood my pain in a way no one else could. They'd lived the same lies, believed the same promises, built their lives on the same foundation of deception. When Margaret cried about feeling stupid for not seeing the signs, we all nodded because we felt the same shame. When Susan raged about the years Raymond had stolen from her, we all recognized that anger as our own. Angela suggested we should contact a lawyer, figure out the legal implications of Raymond's bigamy, determine who had legitimate claims to his estate. But the more we discussed it, the less any of us cared about the money or the property. What did it matter who got the house or the bank accounts or the life insurance policies? No amount of money could compensate for what Raymond had taken from us. No legal victory would give us back the decades we'd lost. Instead, we started talking about what we wanted our lives to look like moving forward. Ruth said she was going to travel, see all the places Raymond had promised to take her but never did. Susan wanted to go back to school, finish the degree she'd abandoned when she'd gotten married. Margaret talked about reconnecting with family members she'd drifted away from during her marriage, relationships she'd neglected because Raymond had always been at the center of her world. I found myself talking about my work at the hospital, about how nursing had always been the one part of my identity that Raymond hadn't touched. Even in the midst of his deception, I'd built a career, helped patients, made a difference in people's lives. That was real. That was mine. That was something he couldn't take away from me. We made a pact that afternoon, the 7 of us sitting in that sterile conference room under those harsh fluorescent lights. We would not let Raymond's betrayal define us. We would not spend the rest of our lives as victims of his elaborate scheme. We would not give him the power to destroy who we were or who we could still become. We would grieve, yes. We would be angry, absolutely. But we would also move forward. We would rebuild. We would find meaning and purpose in whatever years we had left. Helen was the one who suggested we create something positive out of this nightmare. What if we started a support group, she said, for women who'd been deceived or betrayed? Not just by bigamists, though that was certainly rare enough, but by anyone who'd lived a lie? We could share our stories, help other women recognize the warning signs, provide a safe space for people to process their trauma and pain. The idea took root. We spent the next several weeks meeting regularly, planning, organizing, deciding what form this support group would take. Angela, with her organizational skills, created a structure and schedule. Ruth, who'd worked in social services before retiring, knew how to navigate the nonprofit registration process. Linda offered to facilitate the actual group sessions, having been through therapy training as part of her work at a mental health clinic. I offered my home, the house on Maple Street where I'd lived with Raymond for 40 years, where I'd raised my daughters, where I believed I had a real marriage. We could transform it from a monument to his lies into something genuinely helpful, genuinely healing. The irony felt appropriate. Raymond had used this house as one stop in his rotation of deception. We would turn it into a place where women could find truth and support. My daughters struggled with everything that had come to light. Patricia was furious, her anger directed primarily at her father but occasionally spilling over onto me. How could you not know? She kept asking. How could you live with him for 42 years and never suspect anything? Her questions hurt because I asked myself the same things constantly. Caroline was quieter in her grief, more focused on trying to understand than to assign blame. She wanted to know about the other wives, wanted to meet them, wanted to piece together the full picture of who her father had really been. I introduced Caroline to the other wives at one of our planning meetings. She sat quietly, listening as we talked about our experiences, our discoveries, our plans for the support group. Afterward, she hugged me tight and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Mama. You could have fallen apart. Instead, you're building something." The support group launched 3 months after Raymond's funeral. We called it Second Chances, a name that felt both hopeful and honest about what we were all seeking. We met twice a month in my living room, the space that had once hosted birthday parties and holiday gatherings now serving as a sanctuary for women working through betrayal and deception. Women started coming. Not many at first, just a handful who'd heard about us through word of mouth or seen the small notice we'd posted at the library. But gradually, as word spread, more came. Women whose husbands had hidden addictions or secret families or double lives of various kinds. Women who discovered lies that shattered their understanding of their own histories. Women who needed a place to be heard without judgment, to process their pain without being told to just move on or get over it. I shared my story at that first meeting, all of it. The hospital bed revelation for Mirabelle's story echoed in my mind, but my revelation had been different, public, devastating in its own way. I told them about standing at Raymond's funeral and watching 7 other wives appear, about the color-coded calendars and the meticulous scheduling, about the 42 years of believing I knew my husband when I hadn't known him at all. The other wives shared their stories too, each one unique in its details but similar in its core of betrayal and loss. And the women who came to our group, the ones who hadn't been married to Raymond but had their own experiences of deception, they shared too. A woman whose husband had been embezzling from his employer for years, while she believed they were financially secure. A woman who discovered her partner's entire previous marriage and child he'd never mentioned. A woman whose spouse had been living a separate life online, complete with virtual relationships and personas she'd never imagined. What struck me most was how common it was, this experience of discovering that the person you trusted most had been lying about fundamental aspects of their life. We weren't aberrations or outliers. We were everywhere. All these women who'd built their lives on false foundations and only discovered the truth when everything came crashing down. The support group became the center of my life in a way I hadn't anticipated. I was 73 years old, technically retired from nursing, supposedly in the phase of life where I'd slow down and relax and enjoy my golden years. Instead, I was busier than I'd been in decades. I was answering calls from women in crisis, organizing meetings, coordinating with the other wives to ensure our sessions were helpful and healing, constantly learning about trauma and recovery and resilience. And I was healing too. Slowly, painfully, but genuinely healing. The work we were doing helped me process my own betrayal. Hearing other women's stories reminded me that I wasn't alone, that what had happened to me wasn't unique or special, or a reflection of my own failings. Raymond had been a master manipulator, skilled at deception in ways most people couldn't imagine. I'd been his victim, yes, but I didn't have to remain trapped in that identity forever. I started thinking about legacy differently. For most of my adult life, I believed my legacy would be my marriage to Raymond, the family we'd built together, the life we'd created. That legacy had turned out to be a fiction. But now I was building something real, something honest, something that would genuinely help people. Second Chances was becoming my true legacy. The thing I'd leave behind that would continue to matter after I was gone. The other wives and I grew close in ways I never would have predicted. We'd been thrown together by trauma and circumstance, connected by the worst thing that had ever happened to us. But we chose to stay connected, to build genuine friendships, to support each other through the ongoing process of rebuilding our lives. We celebrated birthdays together, holidays together, ordinary Tuesday afternoons together. We became family, not because of blood or marriage, but because we'd survived something terrible, and chosen to use that survival to create something meaningful. Ruth died 2 years after Raymond's funeral, her heart giving out suddenly one afternoon while she was gardening. We held a memorial service for her at my house, all of us gathering to honor this woman who'd been deceived by the same man but had refused to let that deception destroy her remaining years. We cried together, laughed together, shared stories about Ruth's kindness and strength, and the way she'd helped so many women through the support group. Standing at Ruth's memorial, looking around at the faces of these women who'd become my chosen family, I felt something I hadn't expected. Gratitude. Not for what Raymond had done, never that, but for what had come after. For the connections I'd formed, the purpose I'd found, the person I'd become in the aftermath of betrayal. I was stronger now than I'd been in my comfortable ignorance. I was more authentic, more honest, more truly myself than I'd ever been when I was trying to be the perfect wife to a man who didn't exist. My name is Dorothy Mae Harrison and I'm 73 years old. My husband had 8 wives, and the day we all met at his funeral destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life. But it also freed me to become someone new, someone real, someone who helps other women find their way out of the darkness of deception and into the light of truth. Raymond took 42 years from me, but I still have time left and I'm going to make it count. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.